code that's written in an imperative style tends to be structured like this. In the DOM, you'll have an event, and then you'll have an event handler, which then is in charge of controlling several pieces of state in different places. Right now, I'm converting an app from NgRx component store to state adapt, and I've been doing a lot of these conversion projects lately, but I didn't want to do them the same way I've been doing before. I've been really annoyed when I've been doing these conversion apps that I've been strictly comparing state adapt syntax and minimalism to the other libraries' syntax and lines of code as well. And I stopped myself right at the boundary of the state management code that uses that library, and then I would kind of leave the rest of the app unchanged. But my goal with state adapt was to enable reactive programming that is inconvenient normally in Angular. And I'm not aware of any library that enables it as conveniently as state adapt, although Rx Angular is extremely good. But I don't want to just focus on minimalism. I want to focus on reactivity especially. And I want to push Angular as far as I can. So I'm not going to focus on just the library comparison. I'm going to focus on reactivity and how state adapt enables it, and compare the overall data flow and emphasize when I accidentally fix bugs because it's wired more sanely, like I did with the NgXS app. In that app, I converted it to state adapt and accidentally fixed a bug. So I want to focus on reactivity itself. Okay, so most Angular apps are written in a way that's pretty imperative. With this particular app I'm converting, this is a callback function. This is a callback function that I want to start with. So this strategy I'm taking on this time, I'm trying it out, is to start with at the very top with events and have as much React as possible, and just sort of move my way like from the event source down to derived state or state, and then derived state, and then features, and see how it reorganizes the code to make more sense, and focus less on the minimalism, although that, like, I have done comparisons with NgRx component store specifically before, and the ones I've done have been less code, so whatever. But I feel like when you get so minimal, it's not really the point anymore. The point is the code organization, and honestly, I would rather have a little bit of boilerplate, even though I hate it, and I removed as much as possible from state adapt. I'd rather have that and unidirectional reactive data flow than something that's minimal but imperative. So, yeah. The problem with this is it's not a great separation of concerns. You have a callback function that's burdened with the responsibility and logic of how various pieces of state are going to update because of an event. With reactive programming, the state itself defines itself, and so it will refer to the event and react appropriately. And so all the code will be located right next to the thing it's affecting. So that makes it easy to see why something is a certain way. When you're integrating a new event or something, it's easy to refer to similar code when you're writing it. Whereas imperative code, you kind of have to, in order to understand something, you might just see a declaration like let something, and you'd be like, okay. If the name isn't perfect, you have no idea what that thing is going to be. So, with declarative programming, you can look at something and understand it. Here's the diagram for that. So, maybe a way to start would be to remove the event handler and just create a subject that represents the click. And then what you'll have is in the store, and the component store or whatever, wherever the state lives, URL maybe, those locations in the code base are going to refer directly to this click event, the subject, and determine for themselves what it means for them. So let's say we define that subject But then how do we transition the code over to a reactive paradigm where these state changes are occurring reactively instead of imperatively like this? This is actually a little difficult to restructure. In this particular app, I am using NgRx Component Store, as I mentioned, and at one point I published a reactive store wrapper that you can use that extends the component store, and it's not very much code. Actually, I've got it right here. It is, a certain amount of lines of code. And a lot of it is just to make TypeScript happy with overriding the select method on the store. I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish there was an easy way to say, hey, this method has the same signature as the class we're extending. Maybe there's a way and I just don't know. But for now, this is how it is. Ultimately, I'm going to be converting this to state adapt. But if I'm going to do this incrementally and start with subjects first and have all the state react to it, I need a way to incrementally make NgRx component store reactive. So I'm glad I made that utility. I'm going to use that and extend that. So let's see where I did that. App Store, this is where I did it. And I'm going to zoom in a bit more. You can see here that I am extending the reactive store instead of a component store. This is just a replacement, like a drop-in replacement for a component store. And it allows you to use this syntax right here. React. And then you have the state change name and the observable that causes it along with the payload. Anyway, so that's the strategy. Incrementally move with those reactive utilities, and then at the end swap out component store for state adapt. Okay, but here's an issue. What about the third thing? The third thing that needs to react is the URL. And as I'm doing these conversion projects and focusing on reactivity, I'm going to run into a lot of imperative APIs in Angular, because Angular isn't actually a very reactive framework, it turns out. It's not very well integrated with RxJS, but even then, router might be a special case. How do we know when something is a special case? Because we are given these default things from different, from Angular, and do we just deal with it, or do we create a custom wrapper, a declarative API to wrap around it so that we can code reactively with it? Or do we just sort of say, you know what, this is a special case, there's no way to do this reactively, it's got to be imperative. And the router might be a special case. But we have to try really hard, I think, to create declarative APIs because they're so much nicer. For example, with Angular, it happens to be the only framework that I looked at out of 9 where dialogues are opened imperatively. And I don't understand, well, I actually do understand why. Angular kind of carried over a lot of things from AngularJS, including the component libraries. And AngularJS just hasn't updated, or Angular hasn't updated to kind of the way everyone does dialogues now. And I even saw a YouTube video, a comment where someone was like, yeah, but I kind of want more control over it. I'm like, what control do you need? Like, what? If the dialogue is open or closed, that's state, and it's in the UI. Do you complain that you don't have more control over everything in the UI? If you do complain about that, why aren't you using vanilla JavaScript or jQuery and imperatively controlling everything? But no, it's just because we're not used to it, and people kind of hesitate to try new things and change their mind. And that's the problem with reactivity, is it makes people have to change their mind a little bit. And it's way cleaner and way easier once you do, but it looks like so far we're still not changing our minds in the Angular community. It's pretty annoying to me. But anyway, so like I said, this is dialogue state, and I definitely think this should be declarative, but router state is kind of an exception possibly. And again, I'm following along this article that I wrote as I was thinking through this. I literally was trying to figure this out while I was writing this. So thinking about router state. Dialogues and router is actually kind of similar, because with with the router state, you have a URL at the top here. Is that in the UI? Should there be, would it be okay to have some kind of component that represents this state? But where would you put it? It's in the top of the page, but so is the modal, the modal opens in one place in the DOM, right? No matter what component is triggering a modal to open, it's opening it away from its own template, away from its own DOM nodes, out at sort of like a global object. But all these other libraries are providing you a component to treat the dialog as if it's being opened right there inside the component you're using it in. And I've used this in React, and it's perfect. I've used it in Angular too. I've created a wrapper for it, and it's perfect. There's no reason this shouldn't work. So when it comes to router state, maybe that's not a crazy exception either, because you do have this global thing, and you might want to control it from a component. So what if you created a wrapper component for the URL so that you could, instead of calling router.navigate like we're doing with, right here, instead of calling this, what if you have a wrapper component that, just like the modal one changes this .dialog.open to a component where it's got a data binding for open, and you give it an observable. What if we did that for router state? You could have app navigate, and then the URL it's going to, and then an observable for when it should navigate. And the way I think about it is, it's not like it's commanding it or calling it. The way you think about it is more like state, where I probably should have named it differently then, but the way you should think about it is the property that's telling it the URL to go to. It's more like declaring that this is what the URL is right now when this thing emits or whatever. I don't know. Maybe it should just be one property that says URL equals. And so that component gets to own it's kind of like the dialog thing. Each component that uses the dialog component, the wrapper, it declares what is inside of it on its own. So maybe the router component wrapper I create, maybe it should also be kind of like that, where it doesn't sound like a command. It sounds like a statement, like this is this. This is the URL. So yeah, that might be something to revisit. Like I said, in this article, I'm still thinking about this. This is my initial stab at the idea, and who knows what I'll end up with. But at least from a syntax perspective, what I came up with is very nice. So, but I was trying to find a reason not to do this, and so here's what I was talking about with the dialogue template, like the wrapper. This is so nice. And so this is what I was thinking about for the router, is a component like this. You've got URL equals and when equals back click. So you can imagine how this is working. You have a button that calls .next on the subject, and then that value is going to come through, and it's going to eventually come here and then trigger the navigation. And so what this navigation, the way to think about this is declarative. This is the URL. This is declared. This owns the nav bar, like the whatever that's called, the place where you put the URL in the browser. This owns it. I thought about another way of doing this, because with declarative code, you want a central place where the URL is defined, and it reaches out to the rest of the app, or it knows of events that can change it. It chooses what events to react to and how they define it over time. And so you can look in one place and see where or how it's going to be defined over time. But this is similar to the dialogue thing because it's kind of actually unpractical to do that with URL because there's so many things across the entire app that can change it that you'd have to basically import everything or centralize these subjects in one service where the URL is defined. And then the component would have to know about that. And that kind of doesn't even feel very like co-located. It doesn't feel very, very good to me. So I think it's kind of a model similar to modals where maybe you can depend on this being at the top of every component template. And you just know that maybe it can be controlled from the component. So I don't know. I'm still thinking about this. But this specific syntax actually already looks like links. Like, look at this. If you just merge these two things, that's what a link is. So it looks like we're already used to doing declarative routing in Angular. And the issue is if there needs to be a side effect, like some other thing that needs to happen. Something else needs to react to the link being clicked. And then, and I'm actually okay with playing with this and using it and seeing how it goes. So far, it's gone great. But I actually think that it should be kind of like this in this specific component. Because why don't we just use a link? And then we can have these two things react to the URL change instead of them being side effects of the specific instead of them being side effects of this event. Maybe because the goal is to have every event cause the most minimal change in TypeScript somewhere, and then have everything be downstream from that. So what if instead of causing a change in this subject, what if it just changes the URL directly with a link? So that's what I did in this component. So here's the source code for that wrapper component I made. You can look at the article. I'll link it in the description of this video. But I didn't use it for this. Instead of having it like this, I just made it like this. So these state changes happen when you navigate to home from the Movies app. And I don't know if it needs to be, I suspect that this isn't just good when you're going from the movie detail to the home route. I think it's probably good every time you change to the home route, but I did add some specific logic. I'll show you right here. So you can, this is in the router store, not in the router store. This is in the reactive component store. It listens to events. It detects when the navigation's done. It calls pairwise so you can get the most recent one and the one before that event. And then it filters to when the URL changed from the movie detail to, /home or just /. Okay. So this is going to emit an event every time that navigation happens. And this works pretty well, I think. So yeah. So here I'm talking about my reactive utilities I made. So now we can plug in. Yeah, this is where I plug it in. This is where I talk about that code. You already saw that. That was right here. So the thing that's emitted by these observables on the right-hand side are going to be passed into this method. So delete movies is down here. It's going to take undefined. But anyway, so yeah. Yeah, the second parameter is what this method takes in, I think. I think that's how Component Store works. But I'm not an expert. Anyway, so switch flag, these are the two state changes that need to happen in the store. This is the payload that happens to be needed to be passed into the switch flag method. And yeah, the second parameter is what gets passed in as the first parameter of this method. All right. So that's how I did that state change. All right. So to review what we've talked about so far, first one is the router store, or not store, the router state. That is we already have declarative ways of controlling the router state with links. Those links are declarative. It's like a perfectly tight loop where the click event leads to the route change. But if we have an observable that represents events anyway, why don't we just have a link that can take in that observable? That's basically what I think of the navigate wrapper as. That's what I think of it as. And then the other thing that I decided here was to use the reactive store utilities that I made, and that worked out pretty well. So yeah, it's looking good so far. But this wasn't like this project was, it just started with that event, but that was the only event in the component. So I went ahead and converted the rest of the component. And so here's what it looked like at first. This is typical imperative stuff. It's not declarative because the declaration isn't complete, or what's that word? Comprehensive. It's just kind of a hint at what it is. Okay, but then ng on init, it's okay, getting state from the store. If the movie's null, navigate. So here I end up using my wrapper component. I'll show you what that looks like. Right here at the very top. So when movie selected null, you can imagine when that emits. It's when state emits a movie and it's null. Okay. So that's actually pretty nice. I really like this wrapper component so far. Okay, if the movie isn't null, it's going to do a lot of assignments. And a lot of this isn't necessary at all, even in an imperative style, because it's using filter, and this should be map, and array.from. So basically, it's assigning two things here, movie and cast. So what did this end up looking like? First of all, here's how I split the observable into two different things. I could have used the partition operator, but unless there's a huge advantage in using a specific operator that isn't common, I tend not to use it. Filter is fine. And I actually even tried with the partition syntax, and it wasn't really much more minimal than this. I think it was actually the same lines of code and just slightly more minimal. So you know what? It's not worth it. Importing more code, and to just avoid repeating this part, that's not a big enough a deal to me. So anyway, so I defined that when a null movie comes through and that gets passed into the template, and so the URL is defined as being home, like just a slash, when movie selected is null. Okay, and then when the movie is not null, this will emit. Okay, so I put that here too. Cool. Okay, so now we're defining two things, movie and cast. Movie is just going to switch map off of the movie and use the ID to fetch more details. And then it's going to map to the data shape that is necessary. And that's just using the DOM. So all I did was change it from directly using movie, like referring to it, to this ngIf and with async pipe. So that was really easy. Cast, similar stuff. Just use the movie, switch map, grab the cast, and return the new shape. And also filter by the ones that don't have profile paths, apparently. So, because we want to show the pictures. All right, and that's that. Here's the before. You can see a bunch of imperative stuff, a lot of different concerns. This was unnecessary, so yeah. And then here's that callback function. I got rid of this because an observable is always going to be truthy. So yeah, this is kind of weird. But yeah, in general, some mixed concerns here and there. I moved some of this to the template, others to the reactive store. Okay, so that was that. Now the after is more grouped together, and it used to have code that was controlling central state. Now that code is where the central state is defined. So way back in the App Store. So the same place that this state is defined is where it's being defined more. Okay, so this extra stuff out here was removed and put kind of where it belonged, where the concern was more similar. All right. So the final result was actually 5 lines of code more for the reactive implementation. So that's too bad. But I think overall it'll balance out and maybe be more minimal with the reactive code. But the main point was there were 13 imperative statements in the before. 13 imperative statements. That's crazy. That's a lot. And it ended up being 0. That's not always going to be possible, but it was definitely possible for this component. And it was nice. So that was a fun component to convert. And let's look at the final diff so you can just see. Here's the diff on GitHub. So, oops. Okay, so yeah. So basically, this is the template. 5 extra lines of code, makes sense. A lot of it was this sprawling onto 5 lines instead of 1 line because they were setting config in the component and in the component class. So that was unnecessary. It was imperative statements that were not needed. It could have been just been declarative here. And then the component class itself, yeah, you saw that. It went from 64 to 49 lines of code because I removed a lot of this extra stuff at the end. But also, I think this stuff may have been more minimal too. The actual definitions of cast and movie. So that was nice. And then there's quite a bit of added code here for the reacting to the URL change. So this is the observable there. And here is feeding it into the stuff, like the state changes. So actually, to do this more work, like to set this up, there was a little bit of extra lines, so like 3 extra lines that won't be added if we do this again on another component. So I do think in the end it'll probably balance out to about the same lines of code, or maybe less, because when we convert the component store, it'll probably end up being more minimal, but who knows? It might be about the same. All right, so that's it. It was only one one component converted to reactivity, but I think I'll go a lot faster once I start seeing repeated things. For example, in the next component there, I think there's a route navigation, and I already have the wrapper component for navigating, so that'll be nice. But I might make a change to it too, so who knows how fast it'll go. But basically, as I go through these, I will address different concerns throughout the Angular ecosystem and figure out how to do them reactively, or maybe when there might be exceptions. One exception I know of right now that in order for it to not be an exception would be quite a lot of work is the DOM events to begin with. Like how I say that the best rule for reactive coding in Angular is to make sure that every event in the DOM makes the most minimal change somewhere else, and then everything else is downstream from that. That actually isn't reactive. Most of it is, but the fact that it's making change somewhere else isn't reactive. The first step is imperative. So what would be nice is something more like Cycle.js, where it's referring to, so you have a piece of state, let's say, and so it's like the reactive store syntax I have, where a state change is referring to an observable, but it can define the observable from the DOM itself. And so if it's a button click, you'd have like a selector for the button and then .click $. And so that state is completely in charge of reacting to the DOM. And then the DOM is completely declarative by itself. It's not commanding anything else to change. It is what it is by itself. But this is another thing that I'm still thinking about, because how are you going to have something that's type safe if it's basically a DOM selector? And how do you have central state that knows about component templates? It just seems difficult. At best, I think it would end up like something like Redux actions, where there are actually three things. One is the event source, another is the state, and then the third thing is the action. So they both import the action type so that they can be guaranteed that they will be in sync. They're referring to the same thing, and it's not just hard-coded strings. And then the problem with that, though, is you are still not directly referring to the event source in the state, the central state, because you can click to definition, and you'll just go to the action. That's just the same as Redux, and I count action dispatches as imperative stuff. However, this wouldn't ever have an action dispatch. It would just have the button say, "Hey, I'm this thing." That actually is interesting. Maybe that. I don't know. I'm still thinking. Maybe you define the button somehow by itself somewhere. In React, you could do this. You could have a JSX element or something, and then you literally just refer to that thing when it has to have a specific ref. So yeah, I'm still thinking about this, and especially with Angular, I don't know if this is even possible. So I'm not even going to worry about it, really. It would be the last thing I really focus on if I do eventually get to it. But anyway, this is how I'm going to do these conversion projects from now on. There's NgRx component store, and then next will be elf. And at the end, I'll compare the lines of code, but I already did some comparisons between these two state management libraries, and they're getting boring to me. It's always a little less code. State adapt is. So, I mean, yeah, it always has been. Well, it hasn't always been. The synthetic sources is really where it became more minimal than even elf. But even then, it was close before. But anyway, so yeah, minimalism isn't the only point. Reactivity matters a lot. So these will be focused on reactivity specifically. And yeah, I'm excited for the next feature and the next one and the next one, and just getting through these challenges and really pushing Angular to its reactive limits. That's going to be exciting. Because there's nothing wrong with this. This is how things should be coded for a good separation of concerns. And so why don't we have tools to make things more reactive? Like Angular reactive forms, except Angular reactive forms is more like Angular imperative forms. So there are utilities we can create to make it reactive. And why don't we? We should. We should be coding reactively, and it should be easy. We shouldn't be fighting the framework constantly. I wish Angular cared more about this, like the framework, and I wish so many things about Angular, but yeah. Yep. I'll be doing still a few more of these. I'm going to release Data 1.0 soon, the end of the month probably, and then I will be focusing on React compatibility with State Adapt a bit, so I'll do a few React videos, so if any people are specific to Angular, like haven't done any React, maybe that would be fun to watch and just see how reactive React really is, because they're pretty arrogant over in the React world. How they're the enlightened ones that know the best developer experience possible, the best patterns, the best practices. But actually, it's not that great. Everything is chaotic. But anyway, so yeah, this video is done. All right. Looking forward to the React stuff, and then I'll do Svelte after, and then yeah. If anything interesting comes out with Angular, like if there's like a conference or anything, I might do another video and like sort of give my opinion on what happened, just sort of like I did with NgConf with the keynote. But yeah. All right. Thanks for watching. See ya.